Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on using DPLA to teach with primary sources. This is Samantha Gibson, and I'm the Engagement and Use Coordinator at DPLA. Today, I'll be presenting alongside two members of DPLA's Excellent Education Advisory Committee, Jamie Lathan and Kate Denial. Before we start, I want to make a couple of quick housekeeping notes. So first of all, can everyone see the slides and hear me? And if so, tell us what you teach and where you're from in the chat box. This will serve as a technology check and help us get to know you. All right, so I'm seeing some introductions come in, so I'll continue with a couple of more items. So you will notice everyone is muted, but we do want to hear from you. So we will ask you to use this chat feature at a few points throughout the presentation. So please don't hesitate to type in questions at any point. And just to reiterate that we would love to keep the conversation in this chat box, not in the Q&A feature that you may also be seeing on your menu. The session is being recorded and we'll make that available for reference and for anyone who is unable to attend. And if you are on a computer, which we strongly encourage, have a browser window open so you can check out our site and follow along with the resources along with us. And now I'll hand it over to Jamie to get us started.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Jamie Lathan, and I'm a high school history teacher at the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics in Durham, North Carolina. I taught a variety of history and social science courses at the secondary education level for the last 18 years. As a member of the Education Advisory Council for the DPLA, I've created several primary source sets. The images that I'm about to show you are from a set that I created about African American soldiers in World War I. Next slide. So take a moment now to view this image. And please type in the chat box some of the things you see in the image. It could include people, what they're wearing, facial expressions, animals, plants, what have you. And as you type them in, I'll give you a few seconds to do this. I'll read out some of your responses. Jason says flowers. Good. Susan says snow, but also flowers. Children seem to like the soldiers, animals. Great. Now from the label, we understand that this is a photograph of African American soldiers with French children in France. I don't know the exact location. It was taken between 1917 and 1918. Perhaps the soldiers had just liberated a French town from German occupation during the war. How does this photo reveal the importance of historical context? What are your thoughts? And if we can go to the next slide, please, and taking a closer view. Yeah, Greg says all the soldiers are African American men. And taking a closer view here, why might it be very important to keep in mind the historical context of this photograph? Knowing the time and the place is actually extremely important in this case. Susan says you don't really think about children in war, so that juxtaposition is very interesting. Great. Lydia wants to know why all the soldiers are African American. Excellent observation. So in this case, who is taking the picture? That's a great question. Who's the photographer? What's his intention with this photograph? Great question, Susan. In this case, in World War I, African American soldiers were segregated, so they were not fighting alongside white American soldiers. In fact, some of the first units that that fought in the European theater in World War I were given to French units and were part of French units, even though they were still considered American soldiers. So segregation is very present in the military. The other thing to keep in mind is that this photograph would probably have, if it was not taken in French or in France at that particular time, if this photograph had been taken in the United States, some of the men in this photograph may have been in danger. Their lives may have been endangered. It doesn't seem like this little white girl is fearful in any way. The one in the lap of the African-American soldier or the one beside the African-American soldier. But because of the racial climate in the United States at this time period, in the 1910s and 1920s, even after, this would have been extremely taboo and would have led to, perhaps have led to violence taken against this man or these men in this photograph. So it's very important. The time and the place of this photograph is extremely important. Now, moving on, next slide, to another photograph. That in this photograph was in the same primary source set that I created. Greg, great comment. I do not know which regiment the soldiers were a part of, but the 369th is one of the most famous of the African-American regiments during World War I, the Harlem Hellfighters. Could have been that unit, I'm not sure. But these are all images from the DPLA, of photographs that were in the DPLA. Here's another one that I found and put in the same primary source set. What are your observations from this one? Take a few moments and chat box some of your observations from this photograph. Looks candid. Great. Grace Ann says that. So the other photograph can look a bit more staged. This one looks more candid. They're sitting closely together. Great. Thank you, Susan. Do you know any differences between completely segregated here? Excellent. Excellent. Leah says that. Differences between the two photographs. How do the two photographs that I chose to put in this set about African-American soldiers in World War I, how do they speak to each other? How are they similar? How are they different? And I think Leah's comment, yeah, the difference is clear. This photograph is completely segregated. There are no white people in this photograph, whereas in the first photograph, there were white children. Men in the background wearing overalls. Great. Thank you, Greg. This one only has the soldiers, right? The other one has civilians. So this one is at a campground in Georgia, Fort Gordon in Georgia in 1918. This photograph was, and what's interesting here is the caption in this photograph reads, and this is included in the DPLA, the caption underneath the photograph read, "Colored soldier reading aloud to illiterate mates." So the soldiers seem happy in France, but in Georgia, they don't seem comfortable. Great point, Susan. So how would you use the two of these photographs in your teaching about World War I? If you were teaching a European history course or a US history course, how would you use the two photographs that I just selected from my primary source set in your classroom to teach about the war? So Joshua says comparing and contrasting views on race in the US and in Europe. That's great. the juxtaposition of how soldiers were treated abroad versus at home. That's excellent. And these are all ways that I have used these photographs in my class and teaching about the experiences of the African American doughboys in the First War. Right, excellent, excellent. Yes, great comments, great comments. Well, thank you all so much for your interactivity in that primary source analysis. I know that in a webinar, being interactive is fairly tough, but I love your comments in the chat, so thank you very much. And that exercise represented one of the ways that an instructor could use primary source documents from the DPLA in their classroom. So I'm now going to turn it back over to Samantha to talk more about the DPLA and the primary source set project.
Great, thanks, Jamie. So in this next section, I would like to briefly introduce DPLA and our primary source sets. So first, what is DPLA? The Digital Public Library of America is a free national digital library that provides access to millions of materials from libraries, archives, and museums across the country. So currently, we have 29 million items from about 3,000 institutions across the country. And you can see with the logos featured on the bottom of the slide here that we're bringing together content from major national institutions like the National Archives and the Smithsonian, right alongside much more local collections from institutions like public libraries like the Free Library of Philadelphia or universities like Bryn Mawr College, for example, that come to us through our state-based partner, in this case, PA Digital in Pennsylvania. So looking at that huge collection of content, you might be thinking is that, sure, with thousands of partners and millions of items, our collections have incredible breadth and scope and value for classroom use, but that's also a lot to search through and to find what you're looking for. And we know that as educators, you're always pressed for time, which is a huge reason behind our creation of the primary source sets. So as I walk you through the project, next slide, please. I'd love for you to follow along with me. So here's sort of two routes for actually getting to the primary source sets, either through our homepage at dp.la and clicking on the sets from there, or you can go straight to the project at the second link. And next slide. So that should bring you to a page that looks like this. So what I'd like to do first is just walk through some basics about what the primary source sets are. So first, next slide, please. The sets are 140 topic-based highlight reels. So they're small collections of some of the best source material from DPLA around commonly taught topics and representing a broad variety of primary source media and formats. Second, the primary source sets are designed for secondary and higher education. So we actually designed the sets with middle school, high school, and early higher ed in mind. And we envision these resources as being very adaptable, adaptable across grade levels, across learning styles, across classroom environments. Next, the primary source sets are created by educators for educators and students. So as we've mentioned, all of the sets are created or reviewed by our team of educators on our Education Advisory Committee, including Jamie and Kate. And we design the sets to be used not just by instructors, but also by students as well. And finally, the primary source sets represent interdisciplinary topics. So we do have a very strong U.S. history collection, but it's not just a U.S. history project. There's also topics on world history, American literature, arts and art history, science and technology, and more. So now that you have a quick sense of what the sets are, I'd love to look at how to find ones to use. So circling back to that main primary source sets page, I'd like to draw your attention to the set of filters and search menus at the top of the page there. So here you can filter those 140 topics by subject, So you can look for course area topics like US history or literature, for example. But that's also a place where you can filter by thematic topic like labor history or African American experiences. The second filter drop down is a time period filter, so you can narrow down on a specific date range. And then the third option is a sort filter, so you can sort the topics chronologically or by which topics are newest on the site. So now I would love to give you all a chance to try out using these filters. This is a great chance to start to dig into the project and see what topics we have that might be of interest to your teaching. So what I'd like to ask is in just the next minute or so, use those filters, subject and or time period, to find a primary source set related to any unit or topic that you teach. Select a primary source set on something of interest, whatever you see, and post that link to the set you selected in the chat box. And the last thing I'd like to ask, it looks like many of the responses we've been getting so far have just been coming to us, the panelists. So if you can set your chat box to chat to everyone, so everyone can see which sets we've selected, that would be wonderful. Great, all right. Tim has shared environmental preservation in the progressive era. Oh, Susan has shared the set on attacks on American soil, Pearl Harbor, and September 11th. Grace Ann has shared the Powhatan people and the English at Jamestown. Great, so already we're getting a sense of the breadth of the topics covered by the project, just in the ones you've selected. So as you continue to post those links, which I encourage you to do, what I'd like to do is just walk you through what you can expect to find in each of the sets that you've identified. And I'm seeing even more come in: the yellow fever epidemic of 1878, Fannie Lou Hamer and the Civil Rights Movement in rural Mississippi. Excellent. So on the next slide, as we move forward, let's say any of those sets that you've just shared or the ones that you've found, when you click on them, it brings you to the main page of the primary source set. So I'd just like to walk you through some of the components that you'll find here. So first, there's a topic overview. And again, these are written to be student-friendly as well. So helpful for you to situate the context of this topic, but also something that you could send your students directly to. Then you'll see 10 to 15 primary sources representing a range of media and formats around that topic, again, hand-selected by the curator who created the set. And finally, you'll see the last thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the link to that teaching guide, which we'll circle back to in a minute. But let's say that you want to select an individual source. So let's say the newspaper clipping that you see on the far right on the page here. So let's say you click on that, it brings you to the source page within a set. So again, I'd just like to highlight a couple of features here. One is the custom written caption at the top of the page, providing brief context and helping to situate that source in relation to the overall topic. Then you'll see the full-size digitized item in a zoomable viewer or media player, whatever is appropriate for the format. Underneath that viewer, there's an optional space for description for additional context that might be needed to help situate that particular source. So you may or may not see that on all of the sources. And then on the right side of the page, you'll see citation information and prompts for student analysis. And the last major component of the sets that I want to talk about are the teaching guides. So on each teaching guide, you'll find a set of discussion questions referencing specific sources in the set and linking right back to them directly. Each teaching guide also has at least one and sometimes multiple classroom activities. So these are designed as a more of a hands-on way of engaging with those sources. And then again, on the right, you'll see an expanded list of analysis prompts and resources. What you won't find on our teaching guides is a lesson plan or a prescribed way of using these resources or this set or these questions. It's all designed to be adaptable and flexible, to reuse and repurpose in your classrooms in whatever way you think will work the best. So from here, now that we've taken a look through the components of the set, I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to Kate to get us started thinking about primary source implementation strategies.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kate Denial, and I'm the Bright Distinguished Professor of American History at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. I've been a college-level teacher for 24 years. Next slide, please. I'm here today to talk to you about SOC, which is a method for approaching primary source analysis that's based on how professional historians undertake that task. Sam Weinberg, an educational psychologist at Stanford, conducted an experiment where he gathered together a whole bunch of professional historians, gave them primary sources they hadn't seen before, and had them think aloud their process of working through them. He found that professional historians consistently undertook 3 key steps. Next slide, please. First, historians source the piece of evidence. This means they pay attention to its point of creation, kind of like going to the source of the Mississippi River to figure out how it starts. Sourcing includes asking questions like, who created this primary source? When? For whom? What kind of source is it? A map? A diary? A photograph? It also includes pausing to ask what these pieces of information tell us before we begin to try and make meaning out of a source. Next, please. Weinberg found that the next thing professional historians do is put a primary source in context. They ask themselves what else they know about the time and place in which the source was created. They think about whether they've read anything about the creator of the source. They compare and contrast the source with other pieces of information they already have. And if they don't know very much about the time the source was made or the place it came from, they corroborate. Next, please. Corroboration is the act of cross-checking your inferences. You might go find a book about the time the source was created, or check a map to discover more about the place. You might consult a website, a blog, or an academic article. You do this with several other sources to see if your hunch holds up, or whether you need to adapt what you thought the source meant. For 11 years, I worked with a program in Iowa called Bringing History Home, which worked with K-12 teachers to increase the amount of hands-on history their students were doing. We looked at Sam Weinberg's work, and we realized there was an extra step that would help beginners know how to methodically analyze a primary source. Next, please. That step was to slow down and observe what was in the source before we contextualized it. This means different things for different types of sources. If it's a written source, we'd ask people to come up with a 1-sentence description of what the source was about, plus a list of details that backed up that 1-sentence description. If it was a visual source, we'd list out everything we could see, from the clothes people wore to the expressions on their faces, to the number of stars in the sky, to the celestial creatures illustrated in the margins of medieval manuscripts. This is a really important step, as our brains are programmed to make meaning out of things very quickly. But if we don't slow down and observe what's in front of us, making sure we've paid attention to every little detail, the meaning we make can be wrong. Next, please. The 4 steps together. One of the best ways to analyze a primary source is to SOC it, to source, observe, contextualize, and corroborate. Detailed SOC sheets are available to you at a link at the end of this webinar, so you don't have to create a handout for yourself. We've done it for you. And now I'll pass things back to Jamie.
Thank you, Kate. So Jamie here again, and as I mentioned earlier, I had the privilege to create several primary source sets as a member of the EAC. I chose the topics for my sets, usually based on my own personal interests or a cool document that I found while browsing the DPLA. In the next few moments, I want to walk you through my creation of a primary source set. This one in particular is called the Eugenics Movement in the United States. So I currently teach a humanities interdisciplinary elective high school course called Race, Leadership, and Ethics. In the course, we spend a unit talking about the ethics of genetic engineering and eugenics and the implications of those ethical dilemmas on different racial groups. This primary source set provided me an opportunity to do additional research on the topic for my class. You can find this primary source set through a number of ways. Next slide. Here are a couple of ways. You can browse the DPLA and the primary source sets, use the filters at the top of the page to view United States history subject, and then use the second filter to choose the emergence of modern America. Or you can go directly to the link there. Next slide. While I found literally hundreds of sources, sometimes thousands of sources related to eugenics in the DPLA, I chose the documents for this set based on prominent historical figures connected with the movement. Gender, I wanted to get men and women speaking about the topic. Race, I wanted to get whites and blacks speaking about the topic. Time period, some of my documents were from earlier time periods and some were more contemporary. And then types of sources. I was interested in finding sources that were audio, textual, visual, or other. Next slide. Most of my sources were mostly textual sources, like a letter from Margaret Sanger. Some were visual, like a poster about a Better Baby contest in Indiana. One was actually an audio file of a Nobel Prize recipient giving a pro-eugenics talk at Sacramento State College in 1971. Another was a report to North Carolina then Governor Bev Perdue, outlining recommendations for financial compensation and mental health services for living victims of eugenic sterilization in North Carolina from 1933 to 1973. The primary source in this slide is a 1945 informational pamphlet about sterilization in North Carolina. Next slide. After finding those sources, I wrote a teaching guide that included 10 to 15 questions that directed readers to use the sources to answer the questions. So each question was like a miniature or a shortened version of an AP-style documents-based question. Also, at the end of these discussion questions included 1 to 2 activities that accompanied the set. Next slide. Many of the activities in the primary source set provide plans about how one could implement the primary sources into a classroom. One idea, like this one, is to take a primary source set and frame a student debate around it. This particular primary source set is from a primary source document is from another set that I created on Manifest Destiny. The students have to understand the document well enough to take a stand on the document and have an opinion about it. This primary source set is from a contemporary poster about Manifest Destiny and different opinions about that movement. Next slide. Another implementation idea is to use the primary source set or primary source document to contextualize a current event. This source from my set on Negro League Baseball is a letter from Jackie Robinson to President Eisenhower, criticizing him for not taking stronger actions for civil rights. You can have students compare this letter to present day actions of athletes like Colin Kaepernick or LeBron James. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to get more of your thoughts. So in the chat box, include some ways that you use primary sources in your classroom. I'll give you a few seconds, a few minutes to chime in on some ways that you've used primary sources in your classroom. So Susan has used them as historical context for literature that they're reading in class. Excellent, thank you, Susan. Marty says he's used them to have students do one or more primary source analysis using a modified worksheet from National Archives. Excellent, I've done that as well, and comparative document exercises. Great, thank you, Marty. Yeah. This is great, some great ideas. Tim has brought in vintage consumer packaging to point out differences with today's packaging. Excellent. I'm sure you're like me, when you use primary source documents, it helps engage students more, where students feel like they're doing history rather than just reading about it or reading what someone else thinks about the moment they're doing it themselves. Great. Well, thank you again for your ideas, and now I'll turn it back over to Samantha.
Great, thanks, Jamie. So now that we've had a tour of the primary source sets, we've gotten an inside look at the curation process that Jamie went through. Kate has shared the SOC analysis strategy, and we've all exchanged ideas about how participants are currently using primary sources. We'd like to push the conversation one step further and ask you to think about a new instructional idea that you might want to try using the primary source sets. So here's what we'd like to ask in the next few minutes. One, explore the primary source sets and find one related, again, to a topic that you teach or that you're interested in. Again, you're more than welcome to circle back to that set that you found earlier. This time, dig a little deeper and check out some of the specific sources featured in that set and browse through that teaching guide. And then what we'd like you to do, again, in the next 5 minutes, is come back in the chat box, share a link to the set that you chose, or the teaching guide, or an individual source with a sentence about how you might use it in a class, in a classroom setting. So as you get started, I just want to emphasize there's really no wrong way to approach this task. Again, you can zero in on a specific source or a discussion question, for example, in the teaching guide, or look at a set as a whole and use all 15 sources, for example. We're just interested in hearing what are some of the ideas that come to mind that you, as you look through these resources. I've seen a couple of comments now. Maybe I was mistaken in the chat settings. So just go ahead and chat to all panelists. That's fine, and we'll just read all the responses we get. Sorry about that. And the other thing I wanted to say, I think there are some folks on the call who, even if you don't work directly in a classroom instruction setting, if you're from a library background or a student, please participate as well. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us what grabs you about the project, or a specific source or question that you think is interesting. Okay, so Marty has shared the set on the Exodusters, African American Migration to the Great Plains, a personal favorite, if I say so myself, and says, I just sent this citation and link to one of my students, a senior undergrad who's writing her research paper on this topic, and is being a little sluggish about finding sources. Great, so thanks, Marty, for sharing this as, helping to support student research. Okay, Susan says, as an English teacher, I would use FDR's speech, Day of Infamy, and President Bush's speech on the evening of September 11th and have them compare rhetoric. Excellent, thanks, Susan. All right, if you are still browsing through a set or generating an idea, that's more than okay, of course, but start to circle back to the webinar and even just let us know which set you're looking at and even the seed of an idea. We'd love to hear it. Okay, Jason has shared a source from the set on Pablo Picasso's Guernica and Modern War, specifically an image of a child's drawing depicting war, and it could be used by students exploring how children express their views on war. Yeah, excellent. That source is a really powerful one, so thanks for highlighting that. Okay, so Grace Ann has shared that she's looking at the set on women's suffrage and the campaign for the 19th Amendment. So she would want her students to think about why almost all the images are of white women. Why do we think this is? What more information do we want to answer that question? Excellent. So using the sources in that set to spark student inquiry, student research around the question of race in the campaign for the 19th Amendment. Thank you, Grace Ann. Okay, and we've have another idea submitted from Tim, who's shared this set on electrifying America and the specific source. Compare how electricity was presented as a futuristic or novelty, and then use that to compare to today's electric lifestyle. I like that phrase, electric lifestyle. Thanks, Tim. I'm going to take a look at which source you picked. Oh, a really cool one. So Tim has shared the photograph in that set from the World's Fair Pan American Exposition in 1901 with all of the buildings lit up by light, sort of showcasing the power of electricity. Okay, if anyone else is still working on an idea, we absolutely want to hear it. So please feel free to add it to the chat box, even if we've moved on to the next segment. And thank you so much to all of the participants who have shared ideas. And one more just came in from Joshua. I work in an academic library now, but I used to teach rhetoric. I think the fake news set is excellent for providing a currently exigent topic and showing how it's rooted in history. So that set is on, it's called Fake News in the 1890s, and it's on yellow journalism and around the beginning of the Spanish-American War. So yes, thank you so much, Joshua. That one really, to Jamie's point earlier, provides an opportunity to contextualize some current events. So again, please don't stop sharing ideas, especially if you're still working on the finishing touches of one. But in the interest of moving us forward, I'm going to hand it back over to Kate.
So another way to use the resources at DPLA is to make your own primary source set for the students you teach. There may be a subject or a period of time or a person you'd really like your students to investigate. So how would you go about doing that? Well, here's how I went about making a set about reservations, resistance, and the Indian Reorganization Act between 1900 and 1940. Next slide, please. The first thing I had to do when I created my set was identify a gap in the primary source sets that had already been created. I wanted to know more about the history of American Indian communities in the 20th century. So once I settled on that subject, I did a broad search for American Indian in the DPLA holdings. Next, please. When you make any search, you'll get a list of results immediately and a sidebar on the left of your screen offering you lots of ways to narrow your search further. You can narrow by the type of image you want or the subject you're trying to hone in on. Next, please. When I'm starting a search, I find it most helpful to limit my search by years. So if you were looking at the American Revolutionary War, for example, you might search from 1775 to 1783. Here I searched for 1900 to 1940. Next, please. Once my results were limited by date, I then began to think about what type of sources I wanted to gather. A good set has lots of different sorts of sources: visual, textual, maybe even film or radio if you're researching a more modern subject. You can see the options I had on my search right here. Next, please. At some point, you will find that you get diminishing returns if you continue to try to narrow your search results to find the perfect source. Instead, just scroll. I do this in my own research as well as in creating primary source sets. I narrow the field a little, and then I scroll through the sources to see what sort of results I'm getting. I've discovered sources this way that I didn't know existed before, and I wouldn't have known which search terms to use to find them. Next, please. This is a glimpse of 8 sources from my finished set. You'll see that there are all kinds of sources: government records, photographs, a school's internal scheduling system. Next. Here you can see I have a public health poster, a map, some propaganda pieces, even a film. Be creative. The more types of sources you can share with your students, the more interesting the set becomes. They also get to practice analyzing different points of view to contrast the perspective of a government official with that of a public health worker or an American Indian person themselves, for example. They can corroborate their inferences by comparing and contrasting sources from within the set you've created, and the sky is the limit. And now back to Samantha.
Thanks, Kate. So with this last segment, what I'd like to do is just build on what Kate has shared and add some additional tips for searching DPLA. So, you know, we have built the primary source sets and we have 140 topics represented, but let's say you don't find the perfect source or topic that you're looking for, you still have all of DPLA at your disposal. So I just want to walk you through that search experience to help connect you to what you're looking for. So you can start on our homepage, which you can find at dp.la. And it's a really simple keyword search box that you'll see right in the center of the homepage. I've entered a sample search here for Nat Turner. And this is what that set of search results look like. So Kate has already shared some of the ways you can use the facets on the left side of the search results to narrow the items that the search has generated. And then on the right is where you see that list of results to choose from. So let's say I was interested, and I am, in the Bible belonging to Nat Turner, and I click on that source. So that brings you to the item record page. And what you see here is additional descriptive information about this item. So for example, we can see that it comes to us through our partners at the Smithsonian, and specifically from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. You'll see additional information on that page about subject areas or rights and reuse permissions. But the thing that might be most clear about this page is that you're still seeing quite a small version of that particular item. So if you do click on that View Full Item button, it takes you to the Smithsonian collections where the full-size digital record of this item exists. So in that way, it's really helpful when you're searching DPLA to think of our website as a referral service, that we've brought all this information about these great materials together, and then we're going to help connect you to where you can find that full-size digital item online. And so in this case, this connected us to the Smithsonian. In other cases, items will connect you to local public libraries or our state partners or museums and all kinds of those contributing institutions. So next, I want to just share some search tips to, again, help you craft a successful search experience. So one is that try using quotation marks to include exact phrases. That will help you be more specific in your search terms. You can use Boolean operators to combine multiple search terms on DPLA. And you can also use wildcards, so use an asterisk as a substitute for any collection of characters within a word. The disclaimer that we offer here is that we're not Google. No search engine is Google except for Google. And so a little creativity and a little persistence goes a long way in helping to connect with, again, those great materials. As Kate said, having the patience to do a little bit of scrolling really pays off. So let's look at how those search tips might work in practice, for example. The words on DPLA, the words woman and women in your keyword search will generate a whole different set of results. So if you use that wildcard character, that will solve it because it will search both terms at once. So you make sure you're not missing anything from a keyword search in that way. The second example shows off how quotations around a phrase like Ellis Island might help narrow your set of search results. And then finally, we do want to reiterate that, again, our materials in DPLA are coming from thousands of different institutions, and that means that there might be many different ways of describing the same thing. So you consider all of the ways people may have described World War II, for example. And so, again, if you're looking for something there, try all of those keywords. Try everything you can think of, because you never know how something has been described. So next, let's put some of these lessons into practice. So searching DPLA effectively is all about keywords. So I'd like to ask, what keywords would you use to search DPLA for items related to the artist formerly known as Prince? And give us some examples in the chat box. No one? Well, you can imagine that just searching. Okay, so we've got a phrase, in quotations, artist formerly known as Prince. Excellent, so that would offer a very specific set of search results. We also have a suggestion, Prince and singer, or Prince and Purple Rain, Prince and musician. All of these are great ideas, and exactly putting into practice that we combining multiple keywords and trying multiple sets of searches will generate the best results. So thank you all for participating. So with that, we'd like to move on to sort of the wrap-up portion of the webinar. And we'd love to hear from you another great suggestion, Prince musician, Minneapolis pop rock guitarist. Thank you, Tim. So sorry. As we wrap up the webinar, we'd love for you to think about and for you to share something of value or a new idea that you're taking away from our session today. And if you do have any questions about the project or about DPLA, we're also happy to answer them at this point. Great, so Lydia has shared a great question. Who can create or submit primary source sets? So all of our primary source sets have been created in partnership with our Education Advisory Committee. And so we, at this point, are not accepting primary source sets by external curators, because it was really important to us throughout this project to make sure that the primary source sets are not just created by, but reviewed and vetted by our team of educators that also helped generate the format for what these primary source sets would look like. So, so that has been our process to this point. But thanks for that question, Lydia. So let me see. Tim asks, who provides your funding? Which is a great question. So I can give you the broad answer, which is that much of the, nearly all of the work at DPLA since its founding has been grant funded by a combination of private foundations and national funders like IMLS and NEH. And we've also had funding and specifically support for our education work from a set of smaller foundations who, again, we're excited about the work that we were doing and have supported the work of the EAC since 2015, and even a research phase about where we fit into the education landscape before that. So the short answer, maybe I should have started with, is that it's grant funded right now. Susan says, I will definitely use this amazing resource in my classroom and share it with colleagues. There are so many topics that are useful and free. Thank you, Susan. Marty says, having a bit of cloistered time to check out DPLA website and resources is my biggest takeaway. Also, a quick overview of how DPLA works. Excellent, great. So I'm glad that that piece was successful, Marty. And if you do find you have any follow-up questions, we encourage you to be in touch. Great project, thank you, and very inspiring from the librarian at the Quebec National Library. Thank you very much. Okay, well, please, again, don't hesitate to share any additional questions or comments that you have. But in our last couple of minutes, I'd like to recognize and thank my excellent co-presenters, Jamie and Kate. You'll see all of our contact information here on the slide. So please, again, don't hesitate to get in touch with us if you have any follow-up questions. We also encourage you and would love for you to stay in touch with DPLA. So we have an educator mailing list that we would love for you to join. If you haven't already, you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And a couple of ending on some housekeeping notes, just like we started. We will publish the recording to this session, and we'll post it on our website. So it will be live in the next couple of days. And you can download the SOC analysis worksheets that Kate used at that bit.ly link, and the slides are there as well. So it's bit.ly/DPLA primary sources. All right, I've been seeing some thank yous. Again, oh, we just got an additional question. Thanks, Joshua. Any thoughts on reaching out to teachers K-12 or post-secondary to raise awareness of DPLA as an awesome resource? We are really excited to do that work, and actually have been engaged in a grant. Our most recent grant has helped fund us to do presentations in a variety of settings, including education conferences at colleges and universities, and with schools of education. So that's one way that we have been working to reach new educators. And if you have ideas of what else we could be doing, we would love to hear them. So just reach out to us at education@dp.la. So with that, I think I will wrap things up. And again, thank you everyone for joining us and for your contributions. We greatly appreciate it, especially all this interactivity after your days. So thanks so much and have a great evening.